Number 1. So a little backstory before I start. I work at a debt collection agency in Italy. We mostly specialize in vehicular repossession, though sometimes dabble in other fields as well. A lot of people out there that owe a lot of money. It's not a glamorous job by any stretch of the imagination, and us repo guys have a reputation for being heartless and compassionless. I'd say that's far from the truth. Some of the best guys I know work repo. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. This particular incident didn't happen to me directly, but to a friend and colleague of mine. We'll call him Marco. It was a few years back, and Marco had a car that he needed to go and collect. The owner had missed payment after payment, and it now fell to Marco to repossess the vehicle. Well, that's exactly what he did. He drove down to this neighborhood and found the owner's house. The place was far from fancy, and it was obvious that this guy couldn't afford this car. Whoever lived there wasn't home, but the car was out on the driveway. At that time in Italy, we didn't need to speak with the owners to repossess any items outside their property. Marco went ahead and loaded the car onto the back of his truck. Then he drove back to base camp. The day goes on, and him and I are on our break, having a coffee in the rec room. As we're relaxing, the company phone starts to ring, and Marco goes ahead and picks it up. Sure enough, it's the guy who's had his car repossessed. Oh, here we go, Marco thought. Time to get cussed out by this arsehole. The thing is, the guy on the line isn't concerned about his repossessed car. All he wants to know about is an item in the trunk. A briefcase. He keeps yammering on and on about how important this case was, and that it was essential that he had it back in his possession immediately. Pretty stupid to leave something so important in the back of a car you haven't been paying for, but still, happens all the time. Marco went and checked the trunk of the car, and sure enough, there was a briefcase inside. Since the case was combination locked, Marco had no idea what was so important inside. Of course, besides that, it would have been totally unprofessional to look. Still, he was a little curious, so he asked the guy. "That doesn't concern you," he said, or something to that effect at least. "The only thing that matters is that I have that case back in the next 30 minutes. I have a very important meeting, and I really need that briefcase." He keeps insisting and insisting that he needs it, getting more and more stressed. He was obviously nervous, breathing heavily down the phone. My friend told him to calm down. "Okay, you need your case, I get it. It's not like the case is missing, it's right here. You can come by and get it right away if you need it that bad." Well, Marco and I are thinking this guy must be some high-flying businessman or something, albeit one that couldn't afford to pay his debts. Maybe he had a gambling addiction or something. The flashy car may have just been to save face in front of his friends, make it look like he had a lot of disposable income. Whatever the case, it didn't matter to Marco. In this business, numbers are king, and this dude was in the negatives. Anyway, the guy tells my friend to stay put. He's coming over right away to grab the case. Fine, whatever. Marco sits there and waits. And waits. And waits a little more. For someone who sounded so desperate to get his briefcase back, he sure as hell was moving at a snail's pace to come and collect it. Marco had some other stuff to be getting on with, and couldn't sit around all day waiting for this guy to turn up. So, the day comes to an end, and Mr. Briefcase is a total no-show. Same story the next day, and the next. If possessions aren't collected after a certain point, they get sent to be auctioned off. So, when enough time had passed, that's exactly what happened to everything in this guy's car, including the briefcase. It got passed on to someone higher up the chain, and that was the last thing Marco heard about it. The days roll by, and Marco comes into the office one morning with a newspaper. He told me that the police had visited him the night before and asked him a bunch of questions. About what, I asked. He drops the paper right on the desk in front of me. Page 7, he said, or some number close to that. Goddamn. Mr. Briefcase. right there in black and white. His mangled body had been found in a wooded area by a dog walker, barely hidden in a shallow grave. There were numerous deep cuts all over his body. Several of his fingers were missing, and his genitals had been completely cut off. There were rope burns around his wrists. The police believed he had been tortured for hours before his death. The final blow appeared to be a bullet through the forehead. No calling card or anything like that. Marco told the police what he knew, but nothing ever came of it. Makes me wonder whether the police wanted to find the killers at all. God knows what was inside that case. Must have been some seriously dirty laundry though. Drug money for some mafiosos, a debt that he owed some loan sharks. Maybe he was a desperado that had stolen it from some big shots and was about to go on the run. He was in some major debt after all. Whatever the case, he missed his deadline, and that's all that mattered. Since the contents of the case never made the papers, I'd say it's safe to assume that somebody opened it up and liked the look of whatever was inside. Probably pocketed the whole lot and swept the case under the rug. It's a greedy, selfish world out there. Stay out of debt, folks. Number 2. I was a repo man for 8 years here in France. Ask anyone who's worked this job, we've all got a million stories to tell. There's rarely such a thing as a normal day at the office. That being said, a few incidents stand out above all the others as being truly shitty. The real big turds in this quagmire of crap I've waded through. Here's an example of one such job, one that I'll never forget. My colleague Oscar and I were instructed by our boss to go and reclaim this car. It belonged to some dude who defaulted on multiple payments. This was a pretty standard job, probably the most common we had to deal with on a regular basis. Plenty of people like fancy cars, and plenty of people can't afford to pay for them. It fell to us to go and collect them. We hop in our truck and hit the road. Oscar drives while I tell him where we're headed. Now, this place was remote. I'm talking way out in the middle of nowhere. I could see why this guy needed a car so bad. We got onto this old dirt road that seems to go on forever, completely surrounded by thick woodland. It takes us ages to get there, and when we finally do arrive, it's this run-down, rickety French farmhouse. Seriously, this place was falling apart. I knew as soon as we arrived that this guy was going to give us some trouble. He was out there on the porch already, sporting a wife-beater and a thick, bushy beard. I could tell right away that he was a big guy. Muscular, I mean. Sort of reminded me of a lumberjack. This didn't faze Oscar and I too much. Most guys who work repo are big themselves. You pretty much have to be. Plus, there were 2 of us. What was this guy gonna do? We announce our presence and tell him we're here for the car. He starts huffing and puffing, calling us every name under the sun. You get used to that in this line of work, so we just ignored him as best we could and got on with the job at hand. Most of this guy's attention was aimed at me. Guess he didn't like the look of me more. He starts giving me this nutty, biblical speech about righteousness and damnation, screaming at the top of his lungs. Honestly, it was a little unsettling to listen to. Then, out of the blue, all of his sound and fury just melts away, and in a real quiet voice, he says, "You take my ride, I'll take your life." I'd had my life threatened before a ton of times, but something about this guy's tone was really convincing. He meant every word he said. Still, it's not like we were about to call it quits and leave empty-handed. My buddy gets on the phone with the cops and tells them the situation. Says that we're going to need some support, since this guy's being far from cooperative. We have to do this on occasion, when the debt owners don't want to make things easy for us. It's not so uncommon. We're pretty much just standing around and waiting for the police to arrive, while this guy hurls more and more abuse at us. To put it lightly, he's most displeased. "Fuck you then," he announces, and with a face redder than a tomato with a rash, he stomps back inside his shack. We figure there's no point in waiting around now that he's given up. Let's just tow this bad boy and get gone. Well, he hadn't given up. Within a minute, he's back on his porch with a goddamn shotgun. Oscar and I didn't hang around to negotiate. He's too close for us to risk getting in our truck, so we make a break for the nearby tree line. A couple of shots ring out as we dash into the trees. We don't stop. As we start getting in deeper, Oscar begins to slow down. Because of the adrenaline, he hadn't even noticed that he'd been clipped by the shotgun blast. This guy hadn't been fucking around after all. He really wanted to keep his vehicle that bad. Oscar was bleeding slightly. Just a graze, but still, it was a fucking shotgun wound. To make matters worse, this redneck son of a bitch wasn't content with letting us get away. His shouts were audible as he came deeper into the woods. We hadn't got far, and Oscar was struggling to keep quiet. I wasn't about to leave my colleague there. The pair of us rolled down into a nearby ditch, and I pressed my hand over Oscar's mouth to hush his groans. My heart was in my mouth as we laid there. I closed my eyes and tuned my ears. I don't know how close that shotgun-wielding nutjob was, but I could distinctly hear the crunching of earth coming from behind us. Thankfully, he passes and wanders off in some unknown direction. We're still terrified that he'll circle around and catch us hiding, but making a break for it at this point was too risky. We held our breath and stayed put until we heard the distinct sound of police sirens approaching the barn house. I don't know whether the guy didn't realize we'd called the police, or just didn't give a damn, but the cops found him inside his home, acting as if nothing had happened. He denied everything, but thankfully to no avail. His recently discharged shotgun was still in the shack, and the wound on Oscar's flank was all the evidence the cops needed to arrest the guy. He was tried for attempted murder, but got a reduced sentence. Said that he had just fired off a warning shot, and said that he was defending himself against 2 aggressive repo men. We know otherwise. You don't fire a warning shot directly at someone. In the end, he just got a couple of years for bodily harm. I stayed with the job for another year after that incident, but eventually gave up when my daughter was born. Too dangerous. I got a job working at my brother's bar instead. Thankfully, everything's going well now. As for Oscar, his recovery didn't take long at all. The wound was mostly superficial. He's still working as a repo man all these years later. That guy was always a crazy son of a bitch. Many moons ago, I had an employee who had previously been a repo man. His best story impressed me with its ingenuity. He'd been tasked with repossessing a vehicle from a number of unsavory folk. Instead of endangering himself, he simply arrived at the property with a large volume of inexpensive liquor and told the debtors that they had won a contest from the local liquor store. He returned about 3 hours later and removed the vehicle without incident. The old Cheapo Pino Depot incognito repo. Well played, sir. Well played. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Sorry for the long absence again. I've actually been working on a building site recently. It's actually sort of like having a membership to a free gym. The only downside is I'm already paying for a gym membership, so no real bonus, but still. I'm actually going to a stag party tomorrow, but as soon as I return from that, I'll start getting to work on some more spooky content for you guys to scare you senseless. If you did enjoy this video, then please smash that like button or I'll smash you. And hey, don't forget to share the scares around by showing this to your friends and whatnot. But until the next one, guys, you will be sure to stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.